It was a beautiful, sunny afternoon at the school playground. The rhythmic sound of children's laughter filled the air, mingling with the sounds of basketballs bouncing and the squeals of joy echoing off the metal swings. Your son, despite his disability, was enjoying the day as best as he could. He sat near the swings, his legs slightly tangled in the chains, but his face lit up with an innocent smile as his classmates ran around him, teasing each other and playing games. Your son had always been quiet and reserved, preferring to watch from the sidelines, but today, the warmth of the sun seemed to lift his spirits. He was surrounded by the bright colors of his peers' schoolyard games, their laughter a source of comfort in the midst of his usual struggles. His eyes followed the movements of the other children, a silent observer in their carefree world. His disability sometimes made it hard for him to engage the way others did, but today, he was content just to be there, in the moment. But the peaceful atmosphere shattered when a voice rang out, sharp, commanding, and unmistakable. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" The voice belonged to HOA Karen. She appeared at the edge of the playground, her figure standing tall against the bright sky, her eyes scanning the area like a hawk on the hunt. Karen had made a habit of overstepping her bounds, always quick to find fault in others, especially when it came to the children at the school. Today, it seemed, your son had unknowingly caught her attention. Karen's sharp gaze settled on him, her expression one of clear disdain. "You're not supposed to be here," she snapped, marching toward him with a sense of entitlement that was all too familiar. "What do you think this is, a playground for everyone?" Her tone was more condescending than reprimanding, as if she were scolding a misbehaving pet. Your son froze, unsure of what was happening. He had been playing quietly, just watching the others, and now this strange confrontation had come out of nowhere. He looked up at Karen, his brow furrowing in confusion. His eyes darted toward the other children, but no one seemed to know how to respond. They continued to watch, uncomfortable, their playful banter turning into nervous silence. "Didn't anyone teach you the rules?" Karen continued, her voice growing louder as she hovered over him. "This space isn't for people like you." Your son shifted uncomfortably, trying to move away from her, but Karen was relentless. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path. He couldn't escape, he wasn't physically able to move away fast enough. The other kids looked away, unwilling to intervene, unsure of what to do in the face of Karen's forceful presence. The air grew thick with tension. What had started as an ordinary day in the playground now felt charged with an unspoken fear, the kind that lingered in the pit of your stomach when you knew something bad was about to happen. Your son's chest tightened, his hands clenching around the chains of the swing as he struggled to push past the fear that was building inside him. He was used to people judging him for his differences, but this felt different. Karen's anger was sharp, pointed. It wasn't just about rules. It was about something deeper, something much more cruel. "Why can't you just leave everyone alone?" Karen spat, taking another step forward. Her aggression was palpable, and it was clear that she wasn't going to let him go without a confrontation. "You don't belong here," she sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. Your son, still unable to fully grasp the situation, instinctively tried to back away once more, but Karen blocked his every movement. She was close now, too close. He could feel the weight of her hostility pressing against him, her eyes burning with disdain. The playground, once a place of safety, now felt like a prison. The laughter and games of the other children seemed like a distant memory, drowned out by the rising tension. Your son, desperate to escape the escalating confrontation, felt trapped. And the children who had once been his peers now watched in silence, unsure of how to stop the storm that was brewing between Karen and your son. The once vibrant playground now felt like a cage, its open spaces shrinking with every step Karen took toward your son. Her shadow loomed large, the harshness of her presence suffocating the air around him. The laughter of the other children had died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. The swings creaked faintly in the background, a stark contrast to the rising tension that clung to the air. Karen's anger, once simmering, now bubbled over. Her voice was sharp, her words cutting through the stillness like a blade. You think you can just do whatever you want? Play where you don't belong, she sneered, her eyes narrowing with disdain. You've got no respect for the rules. No respect for anyone. Your son, trembling but determined to remain calm, tried to shift away, but Karen moved with him, her steps deliberate and forceful. He wasn't sure what he had done wrong, but her words made it clear that he didn't stand a chance. She was going to make him pay for some perceived offense, and he had no idea how to make it stop. Please, I didn't mean to, your son's voice cracked, barely audible, but Karen didn't give him a chance to explain. She leaned closer, her breath hot against his face as she pressed him further into the corner of the playground. You didn't mean to. What a joke, Karen spat. You've got a lot of excuses for someone who's always in the way. This isn't the place for you. I should have you removed. Her hand shot out, pointing to the entrance of the playground as if she were an authority figure. You think I'm going to let you break the rules again? You think I'm going to let you ruin everyone's fun? Your son's heart raced. He tried to back away, his legs stiff and uncooperative, but the chain-link fence behind him gave him no room to maneuver. He looked around desperately, hoping one of the other kids would step in, would say something to make Karen stop. But the children were standing back, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. No one was moving, no one was speaking up. They were all watching, helpless, as Karen loomed over him like a storm about to break. Leave me alone, your son whispered, his voice barely a breath, but it was no use. Karen was relentless. Her eyes narrowed, and a cruel smile twisted her lips. Oh, I'll leave you alone, all right. But not before I make sure everyone knows what you've done. I'll have the authorities here in a minute, and then we'll see how you like being locked up for breaking the rules. The threat hung in the air, sharp and chilling. Your son's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? But there was no time for logic, no room for reason. Karen's anger was like a force of nature, overwhelming everything in its path. His breath came in shallow gasps as his mind searched for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. Stop, your son cried out, his voice trembling. I didn't do anything. I'm not what? Karen interrupted, raising her voice so that everyone could hear. You're not guilty. Well, guess what? It doesn't matter. You don't get to play by your own rules. You don't get to ruin everything for everyone else. Your son's legs shook with fear and frustration. He wanted to run, to escape, but the fear of the confrontation was paralyzing. He didn't know what Karen would do next, and he couldn't find the strength to fight back. His disability left him vulnerable in ways the other children couldn't understand. They couldn't help, they wouldn't help. They were as trapped in this situation as he was, too afraid to speak out or intervene. Karen took another step forward, her finger still jabbing in his direction. The playground, once a place of freedom and joy, now felt like a prison. Your son was cornered, out of options, with nowhere to turn. The oppressive weight of Karen's hostility surrounded him, and it seemed like there was no way out. The other kids stood frozen, unsure of what to do, their eyes flicking nervously between Karen and your son. They were afraid, but they didn't know how to stand up to Karen, no one had ever dared. And so, the silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Karen's voice, growing louder and more venomous. I'll call the cops. I'll make sure you never step foot on this playground again, she declared, her eyes filled with venom. The situation was spiraling out of control, and your son, standing alone in the face of Karen's rage, realized there was no way out. Not unless someone intervened. But the playground, which should have been a safe haven, had become a battleground, a place where his safety meant nothing, and his voice was drowned out by the anger of someone who held all the power. The tension in the air had thickened with every second that passed. Karen was standing just inches away from your son, her face twisted in fury. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the silence of the playground as she leaned down toward him. "You don't get to ruin everyone's fun," she spat, her words dripping with venom. "You're nothing but a burden. You don't belong here." Your son, his body frozen with fear, could hardly breathe. The words stung, each one landing with a weight that pressed down on his chest. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape this nightmare, but his legs refused to move. The playground, once a space where children laughed and played, now felt like a trap. And Karen was the predator, circling him with malicious intent. Just as Karen took another step closer, something unexpected happened. A loud, deafening bang ripped through the air. The sound of the gunshot was so sudden, so sharp, that it seemed to freeze time itself. Your son flinched, his body going rigid as the noise echoed off the playground walls, vibrating in his bones. The world around him seemed to stop for a moment, the air thick with the aftershock of the blast. Karen staggered back, her expression morphing from fury to shock in an instant. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest, her eyes wide as she looked down at the dark stain quickly spreading across her shirt. Blood. The playground erupted into chaos. Children screamed, scattering in every direction, their feet pounding against the ground in a frantic rush to escape the unknown danger. Teachers shouted, trying to herd the kids to safety, but the panic was infectious. Your son's ears rang with the sound of screams and frantic footsteps as the world around him descended into a whirlwind of confusion and terror. But your son remained paralyzed. The shock of the gunshot, the sight of Karen crumpling to the ground, her body sinking into a pool of blood, left him unable to process what was happening. His mind raced, but no thoughts formed. He could only stare as Karen's eyes fluttered, her body twitching as she fell to the ground. The shooter, hidden in the shadows of the playground, was nowhere to be seen, leaving the scene shrouded in uncertainty and fear. Everything around him was a blur. His heart pounded in his chest, his legs trembling beneath him as the chaos unfolded. He couldn't move. His body refused to obey his mind. Was it over? Was it safe? Was he going to be next? A moment later, sirens wailed in the distance, the sound of approaching law enforcement growing louder as they raced toward the scene. But even with the hope of rescue, your son felt nothing but the weight of fear. He could still hear the gunshot ringing in his ears, still see Karen's face twisted in shock as she fell. The sight of her blood spreading across the playground floor was enough to break him from his stupor. Instinct took over. With shaky hands, your son scrambled to his feet, his body moving on autopilot as he looked around for an escape. The panic of the moment surged through him, urging him to find refuge. He crawled toward the closest slide, his breath ragged and his pulse still racing. His legs were weak, his mind foggy, but he knew he had to hide. He had to get away from the danger. The sound of the sirens was closer now, but they didn't feel like a promise of safety, they felt like a reminder of the violence that had just torn apart the schoolyard. As he reached the side of the slide, he pressed his back against it, his chest heaving with every desperate breath. His eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of the shooter, any clue as to where the threat was coming from. But the playground was empty now, save for the bloodstains that marred the once innocent surface. In the distance, he could hear shouting, more voices now, law enforcement arriving and securing the area. But none of that mattered to your son in that moment. All that mattered was the suffocating fear in his chest, the uncertainty that gripped him as he huddled in the shadows. The world outside felt so distant, so far away. The playground, the place he once felt safe, had become a scene of horror, a place where blood had been spilled, and innocence lost. The chaos outside was a blur, but in his mind, the images of Karen, the gunshot, and the fear remained vivid. He didn't know who had fired the shot, or why, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The sirens grew louder, but your son remained still, paralyzed by fear, his heart pounding in his chest. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. The silence was deafening. Your son, trembling and still clutching the side of the slide, watched as the world outside continued to crumble. The screech of police sirens grew louder, but it felt like they belonged to another world, one he could no longer reach. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a stark reminder of how quickly everything had changed. What had started as a normal day had become something else entirely, a nightmare, one that left him feeling small and powerless. In the distance, the frantic voices of law enforcement were punctuated by the occasional shout for order. The playground was now a crime scene, barricaded off by flashing lights and police officers, their movements swift and practiced. Yet, none of that mattered to your son in that moment. All he could hear was the ringing in his ears, the images of Karen crumpling to the ground, the blood spreading out across the playground like a cruel stain on the world he once knew. The police were securing the area, ushering children away, keeping them at a safe distance from the chaos. But as they questioned witnesses and began piecing together the event, something even more unsettling was unfolding. The identity of the shooter was about to be revealed. Your son watched from his hiding spot as two officers spoke in hushed tones nearby. One was talking into a radio, giving updates about the situation, while the other took notes, glancing around the area with a sense of urgency. Your son didn't understand much of what they were saying, but he could see their faces, a mix of disbelief and confusion. The weight of their words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken. Then, a moment later, an officer approached one of the teachers who had been involved in getting the children to safety. The teacher's face paled as the officer spoke. Your son didn't catch all of the conversation, but what he did hear made his blood run cold. The officer was saying something about the shooter not being a stranger, that they weren't someone from outside the school. It was someone the staff and children knew. Someone close to Karen. The officer's words hit your son like a hammer. He barely understood the full scope of what that meant, but his mind raced. Could it be true? The shooter, the one who had created this chaos, had been close to Karen all along? The realization was staggering. What had begun as a confrontation over a small disagreement had spiraled into something far darker, far more dangerous, than he could have ever imagined. As the officers continued their investigation, your son slowly made his way from behind the slide, his legs still shaky but moving on instinct. The police had secured the area, but the sense of safety they tried to offer felt hollow. This was no longer just a playground. It was a place where violence had torn through the heart of childhood innocence. His thoughts swirled as he approached a group of children being questioned. The officers were trying to calm them, to get details about what had happened, but all they were getting were broken snippets of the panic and confusion. He overheard one officer mentioning that Karen had been intentionally targeted, and that the shooter, someone close to her, had planned the violence in response to the ongoing tensions. As the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together, the shocking truth emerged: the shooter was someone Karen had known. Someone who had watched the confrontation unfold, quietly fueling the fire that had led to the explosion of violence. Your son's mind struggled to wrap around the idea that the violence hadn't just been a random act, it had been orchestrated. The chaos wasn't just a product of Karen's unchecked anger. It was a calculated escalation, a deliberate act of cruelty aimed to punish and control. Your son felt a sharp pang of betrayal. The playground, once his sanctuary, was now tainted. It was no longer just a place for laughter and play. It had become a reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface of even the most familiar, innocent places. The world he once knew had shifted, fractured in an instant. The realization was suffocating. As the police began to take control, your son realized that he wasn't just a witness to an isolated event. He had become a part of a much larger story, one that involved not just the violence that had occurred, but the emotional fallout that would follow. His safe space, his sense of normalcy, had been ripped away. He didn't know how to face the world that now felt so different. But for now, all he could do was sit in the silence, feeling the weight of the discovery settle around him like the bloodstains that marred the playground. His mind raced with the questions he couldn't yet answer. And in that moment, all he could do was hope that, somehow, things could go back to the way they had been before. But deep down, he knew that the world had changed, and there was no going back. The days following the incident felt like a blur. The shock of the gunshot, the blood, and the chaos had yet to fully settle in, but something darker was beginning to surface. As the police continued their investigation, the details surrounding the shooter, and Karen's involvement, began to unravel, details that neither your son nor anyone else had expected. At first, it seemed like a random act of violence, a tragic event that was the result of one person's unhinged actions. But as the officers dug deeper, it became clear that this was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The police discovered that the shooter, hidden in the shadows, wasn't a stranger at all. It wasn't just a random bystander or someone with a personal vendetta against Karen. The shooter was someone who had been watching the events unfold, someone who had been manipulated by Karen's influence. The truth came in pieces, slowly, like shards of broken glass that, when put together, painted a terrifying picture. Karen, it turned out, had long been obsessed with control, especially over the children at the school. She had a history of pushing people around, using her position to bully and manipulate others to get what she wanted. But this time, she had gone too far. Karen had been planning something for weeks. She had been escalating the tension in the school, picking at the threads of conflict between her and the students, turning even the smallest issues into major problems. And all the while, she had been subtly feeding her anger into others, coaxing people to take her side, to see her version of the world as the truth. But it wasn't just words that she used, she had planted seeds of rage in others, encouraging them to act on her behalf. The shooter, it turned out, had been one of Karen's loyal followers, someone who had been manipulated by her over time. They had been quietly watching the conflicts unfold, listening to Karen's every word, slowly getting sucked into her twisted web of control. The day of the shooting, they had been pushed to the edge by Karen's rhetoric. Karen, whose control over the situation had always been unquestioned, had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, pushed this person too far. In the end, they had acted, pulling the trigger not just out of their own fury but as a direct consequence of Karen's words and influence. When the discovery was made, the weight of it crushed your family. Karen had not only been the victim of an act of violence, but she had also been the instigator. Her obsession with power, her need to control the situation, had led to the destruction of everything around her, your son, the other children, the entire school community. Karen had played a role in the violence, either by directly provoking the shooter or by fueling the anger and resentment that led to it. The truth was far more complicated than anyone had realized. The news hit hard. At first, there was disbelief, followed by anger. How could someone so twisted be allowed to continue their reign of terror? How could the school have allowed her to manipulate so many people, to bully and control without ever facing consequences? The anger began to boil over, not just for what had happened to your son, but for the countless other children who had been subjected to Karen's cruel behavior over the years. But the fight was just beginning. Your family knew that this wasn't going to be a simple recovery. There was no moving on from this. This was a battle for justice, not just for your son, but for every child who had been affected by Karen's influence, who had been trapped by her lies and manipulation. The truth was finally coming to light, but it would take everything you had to bring Karen to account for her actions. The legal battles began almost immediately. Your family found themselves thrust into the role of advocates, not just for your son but for all the other children who had been victims of Karen's toxic influence. The case became bigger than just one incident. It was a fight against a system that had allowed people like Karen to thrive unchecked. But it was also a fight for the truth, because if this could happen once, who was to say it wouldn't happen again? As the investigation continued, your family found strength in one another. The truth was slowly, painstakingly, being revealed. And with it came a new determination. Your son, who had been the target of Karen's cruelty, would be the face of this fight. The legal proceedings were tough, but the support from the community, the children, the teachers, the families, gave your family the resolve they needed to continue. Karen's reign of control was finally coming to an end. But the battle was far from over. The truth had been uncovered, and the fight for justice had only just begun. The weeks that followed the incident were both painful and transformative. Your son's body had healed from the immediate physical injuries, but the scars left by that day ran much deeper. The emotional trauma was harder to see, harder to address. He spent the days in a haze of uncertainty, struggling with the weight of what had happened to him. The gunshot still echoed in his mind, replaying every moment in vivid detail. It wasn't just the violence, it was the betrayal of a place that should have been safe, the school playground where children were supposed to laugh and grow, not fear for their lives. But despite the overwhelming pain, your son showed an incredible resilience. Slowly, he began to talk, at first, only in fragments, only when he was ready. Some days were harder than others, days when the memories felt too fresh, too raw. But there were brighter days too. There were moments when he would smile, when the laughter of a friend or a simple act of kindness would break through the cloud of sadness. With the support of his family, your son began the journey to emotional recovery. The love and care of those around him became his anchor. His parents, who had been with him through every sleepless night, every tear, helped him piece together the parts of his life that had been shattered. Therapy sessions, initially filled with silence, slowly turned into conversations about hope, strength, and reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him. It was a slow process, but every step forward was a victory, no matter how small. At school, things were different. Your son had to come to terms with the fact that the place he had once found joy in was forever changed. But with the guidance of caring teachers and friends who refused to let him slip through the cracks, he was gradually able to rebuild some sense of normalcy. The playground, which had been a symbol of fear, slowly regained its place as a reminder of resilience, of overcoming the impossible. It was a long way from being just a playground again, but it would get there, piece by piece, as your son found his courage to return. Meanwhile, the story of what happened spread beyond the walls of the school, igniting a firestorm of conversation in the community. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, others who had been affected by similar acts of bullying or violence were sharing their own experiences. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it also sparked something more important, a movement. People began speaking out about the need for stronger protections for vulnerable children, for better ways to identify and address bullying before it escalated into something far more dangerous. Your family found themselves at the heart of this movement, advocating for change, using their voice to stand up for those who had been silenced by fear. Karen, the once powerful figure who had instilled so much terror, was now facing the consequences of her actions. The legal battles continued, but there was a growing sense of justice, a growing sense that Karen's reign of intimidation would not be tolerated anymore. It was a small victory, but it was one that your son took to heart. He understood that while the scars of that day might never fully fade, his strength could help change the world around him. The final chapter of this journey was still being written. As your son stood at the edge of the playground one quiet afternoon, he took a deep breath. The sounds of children laughing and playing filled the air, but they no longer sent a shiver down his spine. The fear, the shame, those things were slipping away, replaced by something new, hope. The playground, which had once been a place of terror, now stood as a symbol of his survival, his triumph. Your son looked out across the playground, his heart swelling with quiet pride. He wasn't the same person he had been before that day, but he was stronger. He was braver. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. The playground wasn't just a place of fear, it was a place of healing. It was a place where the worst had happened, but it was also where he had found his way back to himself. And that, he realized, was worth more than any victory. It was his story now, one of courage, recovery, and moving forward. And though the scars would remain, they would no longer define him.